In this video, we're going to use Spring REST with path variables. And to kind of help us out with path variables, we'll have this new endpoint to retrieve a single student by the ID. So we'll make a GET request to API/students/student ID, and this will retrieve a single student. Now, the student ID in curly braces here, this is known as a path variable, such that when we actually access it via our REST client, we can include an actual value there. So we could say /API/students/0, that'll give us the student with ID 0, 1, 2, and so on. So basically a way of parameterizing your path or the endpoint to actually accept data. Now let's kind of look at this as far as the big picture here. So we'll have our REST client, and then over on the far right, we'll have our REST service. So we'll make a call /API/students/student ID in curly braces. And again, that's our path variable. So then it'll return back that given student. So here, we're just making up an example. It'll return back Mario Rossi. Now, again, we'll actually write the code here for the REST service. We'll add a new request mapping for this. And in our coding, we'll actually create a new student, or we'll retrieve that given student and then pass it back. And just as a reminder, Jackson's going to actually convert that student object to JSON. Alrighty, so let's kind of look and see how this works behind the scenes. So we have our REST client and our REST service. We'll make a request across for /API/students/student ID, and the student ID is in curly braces. And then we'll have Spring REST along with Jackson. They'll make a call to the REST service. So in our code, we'll actually return that given student. And then Jackson will actually convert that student object or that student POJO to JSON and then send it back across to the REST client. And you've kind of seen this process before, but I simply wanted to show you the information again, along with just using a single student object as opposed to an array list. So the development process is fairly straightforward. All we need to do is add a request mapping to our Spring REST service, and then we'll simply bind the path variable to the method parameter using this new annotation called @pathVariable. And we'll see coding examples of this coming up. Alrighty, so let's kind of dig in and let's write some code here. With our student REST controller that we already seen before, request mapping /API, student REST controller, then our little comment here is that we're going to define an endpoint for /students/student ID in curly braces, and we'll basically return the student at the given index. So I'll set up this request mapping here for a get mapping /students/student ID in curly braces. I define a method, get student, that returns a student, and then I have the @pathVariable int student ID. So this will basically bind that path variable that's coming in on that URL, and I'll actually bind it and assign it to this variable here that I have as a method parameter, student ID. And by default, both of those names must match up. Alrighty, so that's the piece there. Now we simply just create our array list of students, and then we just kind of go through the process of populating the students, kind of like we did in the previous videos. And now we can simply return that desired student. So instead of using a real student ID, we'll simply just use that as an index. We'll simply index into their list and then return that given student. But don't worry, we'll do all the fancy database stuff later when we set up our full CRUD application using Hibernate. But this is kind of enough to kind of get us started. And remember, when this student object is actually returned, then Jackson will actually convert that student to JSON, and then it'll go back to the calling program. So down here in this getStudents method, we actually create the list for every request, and we populate it for every request. And that's not the best. That's not good. So let's go ahead and clean this up and refactor this code. So basically what I'd like to do is define a field and then load that field with data such that we only do that work once. Let's start here by defining our field. So we'll create a field list student, and we'll call it the students. And now I'd like to actually load that student list with some data. And what I can do is actually make use of the @postConstruct annotation to load the student data. And remember, @postConstruct is called only once when this given bean is constructed. So this will be a good fit here for our given use case. So I'll define a method here. I use the @postConstruct annotation. I do a public void load data. We can give any method name that we want, but I'll just call it load data. Nice descriptive name here. So we'll create our list and then populate it with students. And what I'd like to do is actually use some code that I've already created. So let's move down to this getStudents method. And let's actually cut this code. So not copy, but let's cut this code. And then I'll actually move up to that load data method and I'll actually paste it here. All right, so I need to make one little change here. I need to actually delete this since we already have it declared above as a field. So let's go ahead and remove list student here. And then basically that's a field up top. And then here we simply initialize it as an empty list. And then we simply go through and add the actual students to that list. This approach is much better because we only load the student data once. So our getStudents method is very simple now. All we have to do is just return a list because the data has already been loaded thanks to the @postConstruct annotation. I want to just run this again just to make sure it still works, just to make sure I didn't break anything. And so here we'll get all three users or all three students, Purnima, Mario, and Mary. So this looks good. And then I also want to test it in Postman, again, just to make sure it works fine over there. So I'm in Postman right now. I keep the same URL, hit the blue send button, and boom, there we go. All three students, Purnima, Mario, and Mary. So I'll write a quick comment here to myself. So we'll define this endpoint for /students/student ID in curly braces. And this is for actually retrieving a single student by ID. And here we'll keep it simple and we'll actually return it by the index of that array list. So I'll set up this get mapping for /students/student ID in curly braces. And remember, the curly braces here for the student ID that's an actual path variable. And I'll just go through and define a method here, get student, that'll return a student. And I'll make use of this @path variable annotation to actually bind that path variable student ID to our parameter here, student ID. By default, the variable names have to match up. So the path variable coming in up top is in the curly braces student ID. Then our method param should also be student ID, and that's by default. Now what I'm going to do here is just index into the list. And like I said before, I really just want to keep it simple for now. So that actual student ID that they're passing in is really just the index from the actual list. So I can access an element in the list by simply saying the students, that's my actual list here, .get, and you give the index. So here we simply pass in the student ID, and that'll give us that person from the actual list. And that's the basic coding. Again, we're keeping it simple for now. We'll get into all the fancy database stuff later on. I'm ready to test it and see how this works. Let's go ahead and run this on our server. And then once it's up and running, then up top I give /API/students, and then I give the student ID or the index. So I say /0, the first element in that list. And it should come back as Purnima Patel because that's the first student that we added. So index is 0. If I do 1, I'll get Mario Rossi. And then if I go through and enter 2, I get Mary Smith. So this is working out as desired. So this is cool. I like this. And let me just kind of copy this URL that we had before. So let's swing over to Postman. And let's create a new tab here. And I'll just paste in that URL. And I'll do /API/students/0. And again, that gives us Purnima Patel because she's the first student that was added. And then we have Mario for index 1 and then Mary Smith for index 2. This all kind of works out as planned. So we're able to make use of that path variable to access a single student. So this is great. But now you're probably wondering, what if I entered some bad data? What will happen?
Oh boy, we have this internal server error, the 500 error. Ugh, this is ugly. Let's find out why this happened. So let's go ahead and switch back over into our IDE. And we see this ugly stack trace. Ugh, awful, awful. All right, so scrolling up, we see the root cause, index out of bounds exception. The index of 999 is outside of the bounds of the length of 3, which makes sense, right? But hey, don't worry about this. We'll cover exception handling in the next video. So instead of the dreaded 500 error, we'll actually handle that exception and then provide our own custom response for that given error message or that given exception condition. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.